In general terms, lakes in New Hampshire and across the country and world have kind of been the repository for the waste of human development, if you want to put it that way. But they've been rebounding over the past 150 years or so, mostly because of regulations. We've used lakes as places to dump the waste as our economic development and our social development in growth in population, things like that. In New Hampshire, we've seen big changes over time, especially as the land use has changed. The lakes are a function, the water quality in lakes are a function of the land use in the watershed. You think a couple hundred years ago when they were growing sheep around here, all these trees were cut down. These are all sheep farms. So all the runoff from the sheep farms was coming into the lakes, and you can tell that by looking at the cores in the deep part of lakes, where during that time period, instead of fine silts and clays being deposited, there were big pebbles and rocks. Since that time, there's more forest now in the US than there was 200 years ago. And that has helped a lot by changing the land use. So Squam Lakes itself is one of the best lakes in New Hampshire. It's what they call oligotrophic status. It means it has very low nutrients, low chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is a pigment in algae, the green pigment, and it has a lot of large depth of water clarity. Clarity is something we really value around here. Everybody likes clear, clean water, so that's something that SLA and the state have been tracking for many years. If you look at the trends in analyzing the actual data, there have been some very small changes over time, but they've been kind of alarming a little bit. We've seen some increases in those chlorophyll numbers. We've seen some increases in phosphorus, and lake clarity has changed in some areas. The problem is where you sample. A lake like Squam Lake, it's not a big round basin with a homogeneous shoreline. It's got very dendritic, irregular shapes. And typically the sampling has been done in the deep parts in the middle of the lake. So the changes in the deep part in the middle of the lake have been very, very small and subtle. I think if we had looked at shoreline areas going back 50 years when some of the sampling started, it might be a different situation, that we might see some real differences. People that have lived here for a long time may notice some subtle changes have occurred. People that come up here, in the past couple of years think it's the most fantastic place on earth, and they always talk about pristine. Nothing is pristine because the human footprint is on everything, chlorine in polar bear hair, from things like that. So one thing we've looked at in the marine systems was the concept of shifting baselines, and that's where people who see the lake now, and this is their first experience, think it's fantastic, whereas people that have been here a long time have seen it degraded a little bit. So the baseline of perception has shifted over time. So we have to prove with data that there really have been changes up here. One of the sharks in the water is the relatively recent development of cyanobacteria blooms in the lake. Small areas, pockets here and there. It's something that's probably occurred in the past and has been under the radar, but it seems to be occurring more often now in recent years, and maybe in more areas. That's hard to quantify because we don't have full coverage all the time on the lake. And it's also a little bit confusing because sometimes big pollen events, tree pollen events, will make a green scum in the water that people will think is a cyanobacteria bloom. So there's been a program with New Hampshire DES for years now to take a sample of water down there when you see something, and they can quantify the cyanobacteria. But they're a little bit problematic because they can produce toxic chemicals in the water, which can irritate respiratory people in their respiratory systems, and can also poison biota in the lake and poison pets and things like that drink the water. They're natural, but there's something that we want to minimize in the lake, and because they can be detrimental to human health, it's good to avoid. Typically the levels that we see that have popped up in here have not been the kind of thing that would close a lake. In some areas they actually close all lake activities because of the cyanobacteria bloom and extensive coverage. Here it's maybe a small cove here or there that happens, and it's something to be avoided until that disappears in 5-10 days. Well, we generally see effects coming from 4 different types of impacts, and the first is microbiological. Like I said, the cyanobacteria, that's a change that's being imparted on the lake. The second is chemical contamination, and we've seen that in some areas from legacy PCBs that were laid down on roads to keep the dust down, pesticides that were applied to the landscape when there was farming. They all bind to the sediments, the soils, and when that gets washed into the streams, gets transported into the lake, and we actually have some contamination of fish in the lake, so much so that the DES has put an advisory on eating too much fish. Don't eat so much fish, eat a fish a week or at the most, that kind of thing. We've also had acid rain impacts, and that's a countrywide kind of thing, mostly from fossil fuel burning in power plants that releases a little bit of mercury as well when they burn the coal, and that rains down into the lakes. And acid rain has been impacting Squam Lake in the Northeast for many years, but the Clean Air Act actually has reversed the decline, or the increase of acidity has decreased over time because of the Clean Air Act. The third thing would be kind of ecological effects that are going on here, and something like introduced species, the milfoil problem, the rusty crayfish, things like that. When we inadvertently introduce other species, there can be effects to the fish populations, the invertebrate populations in the lake, which trickle down into effects on the algae as well. And then we have the climate change, which is the big, 900-pound gorilla in the room. Change in temperature, change in rainfall patterns. Rainfall patterns have a lot to do with the runoff, and the runoff has a lot to do with the sedimentation, water clarity effects, nutrient inputs. All those things are driven by the runoff. So if we have different patterns of precipitation, larger events puts a lot more sediment in the water and the associated chemicals and nutrients. Also in the winter, instead of getting snow, we're getting rain on snow. And rain on snow events have a very different effect on the lake than what we're used to too. So there's a multiple levels of impacts that we're seeing coming down the line, and we want to do what we can to mitigate those things.